Hello, everybody. My name is Rick Rosso. I hold the chair in India and Emerging Asian Economics here at the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington, D.C. This today has become really our signature annual event. In my universe, hanging out with think tankers and academics, a lot of people are regularly opining on the state of the Indian economy. And I would say a lot of times those views are driven partially by a half measure of what we see with concrete economic data and partially by personal views on what they want to see, sometimes a bit of a Rorschach test. I always find that the rating agencies, on the other hand, have to be driven a lot more strongly with a data-driven approach. And obviously that's for a significant reason because their views on what goes well and when things are going sour with economies around the world have a very direct impact on what we see with investment flows. The Modi government was reelected just a little bit less than a year ago with a reduced mandate from what we saw the first two times that it was elected, recording a coalition for the first time since they first came to office back in 2014. We track our own list of 30 significant reforms. We've been doing that since Modi's first term, and we refresh it every single time a government comes to office. And from our viewpoint at the CSIS India chair, we've seen a lot less move so far on major economic reforms. Although recently with the finance minister's budget, there's hopefully some sprinklings of new ideas and big ideas that could get things moving along. But overall, I think that the Modi's party, the BJP, has had a good run since its national election of some state-run elections, and the economic growth numbers still appear to be relatively good, even if you've seen a bit of a decline recently. But I'll let the experts handle that in a lot more detail. We have two featured speakers who will both be discussing how they're looking at India. My friend Joydeep Mukherjee, who's managing director of S&P Global Ratings, and I give the same kind of introduction every single time. Joydeep was one of my original gurus back when I had my first India role covering Indian political economy going back 26 years ago, and really helped me to kind of understand a lot of what I was tracking and watching every single day, since at that point he was already recognized as one of the great leading lights on Indian economic policy. Prior to S&P, Joydeep had a range of roles, including CIBC Wood Gundy, the Asian Development Bank, and as a financial journalist with the Globe and Mail. And also my friend Christian de Guzman, who's a senior vice president at Moody's Sovereign Ratings, who's dialing in from Singapore. Christian has had a diverse set of experiences which provide a well-rounded view about what's happening with the economy. His time in government with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, multilateral with the International Monetary Fund, and also in the private sector with JP Morgan and the law firm White and Case. So two terrific experts that'll help walk us through what they're looking for the Indian economy for the year ahead. But as I always like to point out, India does not live in a vacuum. A lot of what's happening across the Indo-Pacific is going to have an impact on what happens with India's economy. A lot of India's large trading and investment partners are all resident in the Indo-Pacific. So as a scene setter, we always like to have somebody that takes a step back and offers a wider picture and aperture on what we might see in the region, how that could possibly impact India. So my colleague, Aaron Murphy, who's Deputy Director for India and Emerging Asia Economics, is going to provide a bit of the regional scene setter to get us started. Aaron has a diverse set of experiences covering Indo-Pacific economic issues, including at the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, as well as serving as an Asia analyst for the CIA. So we'll kick it off to you, Aaron, first, and then we'll move to Joydeep and to Christian. But the floor is yours, Aaron. Thanks for joining.
Great. Thank you so much, Rick. And I know that everyone's here to listen about India, but I hope to get some converts to the rest of the region as well. So thank you for giving me that opportunity. So what I'm going to do is kind of set the scene about ASEAN-India relations and then talk a little bit more about the region in depth and then turn it over to the experts who will then either completely correct everything I've just said with actual data. But really am happy to talk about how ASEAN's role, Southeast Asia role, and the rest of the region is really working together with India and that they're part and parcel of each other. So ASEAN, and I'll focus mostly on ASEAN because this is the region that is really growing the fastest, not just in the region, but also in the world, and that you have economies that are growing at such fast clips, 6%, 7%, 8% per year. But it is fragile, especially as we go into this year and see how external shocks could undermine their growth and their ability to industrialize. But ASEAN is one of India's largest trading partners. Their exports to India were about $42 billion and imports, the imports from India were $42 billion and the exports to India were about $80 billion. ASEAN counts for about 11% of India's global trade. So that's pretty significant given where India and ASEAN are. There's several economic agreements and other ways that they work together. There's the ASEAN Free Trade Area. There's a trade in goods agreement. There's a trade in services agreement. And then there's sector-specific agreements on business, trade, energy, education, but other areas as well. And that's probably only going to grow. Um, in terms of ASEAN itself, their outlook right now for 2025, and again, I think that this is going to be a pretty volatile year if you're even like passively looking at the news. They have had resilient growth. They've really bounced back from COVID. For a lot of these countries, tourism is really one of their biggest industries, but also in manufacturing as well. And COVID hit those two industries incredibly hard. But they really have bounced back. I think we've seen a lot more growth in Thailand, one where it has, an excellent tourism industry, but they may even get the White Lotus boost. For anybody who watches that show on HBO, the season is in Thailand. So I'm sure, like with Hawaii and Sicily, that they're going to have that whole White Lotus tour. That might be a new economic indicator. Who knows? Um, but there are huge risks as well that they're going to be facing. One key factor is whether the central banks can sustain rate cuts that's going to keep the economic momentum going. We're probably going to see central banks cut rates, but it's going to be varied across the countries. The Philippines are looking for bigger cuts, and this is definitely one of the fastest growing economies in the region, probably one of the more exciting ones as well, especially when you think of manufacturing, but also when you look at Trump's deficit lens at looking at trade relationships, the Philippines is actually in a good place. Thailand will probably also cut rates, but at a much smaller percentage point than the Philippines. Malaysia and Indonesia are probably going to keep things relatively balanced. I would mention Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar. I don't think a lot of people are investing in Myanmar these days. I wonder why. But Vietnam is also probably going to keep rates steady, if not cut them. But they're looking as well as what their trade relationship is going to be with the United States, as they have a significant deficit. The United States does anyway, and they have been the target of tariffs previously. So, but there's a lot of pressure on ASEAN as well. During the first Trump administration, ASEAN really integrated more into China and took advantage of the US-China competition. So they became a destination for Chinese manufacturers moving out of the country. So that's Chinese manufacturers, not foreign manufacturers. And it's partly because Chinese labor is getting more expensive as well. So ASEAN offers an opportunity, a skills base, and also the manufacturing base for that. But because of that, a lot of end use products have some sort of ASEAN component in that. And so if the Trump administration or the EU are looking to really kind of push on the tariffs or push against Chinese dumping and other sorts of trade issues, ASEAN may find itself caught up in that. The other thing is that ASEAN is pretty well integrated in terms of its trade relationships with China. And I would note, I mean, just by dint of their geography, their trade relationships and for some of these countries have existed longer than the United States has been a country. Now, for a country like India, that's probably like a hilarious joke that, 250 years and whatnot. But these are relationships that have been there for a long time, have built and grown over the years, and that you can't just necessarily cut it off. But the region does depend on Chinese consumer growth, but investments into the countries. And if you're looking at the ASEAN economy, you have to look at the Chinese economy as well. So consumer demand is down. They're dumping their products. That's going to have an impact, especially for third countries that ASEAN countries export to. Chinese goods are cheaper. So they're going to probably buy those instead of ASEAN products. So there are a lot of pressures on ASEAN, tariffs, scrutiny on Chinese products, overcapacity. But there's opportunities as well. I mean, ASEAN does shift and is quite flexible. There are certain trade agreements that they can also press on, and that gives India a little bit of a boost as well as an alternative market, both for end use goods, but also working together along the manufacturing supply chain on products. Both India and several ASEAN countries are part of RCEP, And they are also still part of IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which, as of this recording, still exists. I don't think the U.S. is going to be the driver of how that works, but it does provide another area for cooperation. There's also CPTPP, which is the successor to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The members of this grouping have a lot of decisions to make over the coming years as to who to admit as new members. Ukraine's on that list, Costa Rica, but so are China and Taiwan, which of course those are going to be the most difficult to look at and to potentially include. But that gives ASEAN other ways to start building out their markets and trade cooperation to at least diversify their portfolio enough that they might be able to sustain or withstand some of these headwinds that are coming this way. Um, but ASEAN does have some opportunities, but they're certainly being hit hard as well. Factory closures aren't just the worst thing that's happened to the United States, but it's happening to ASEAN as well, especially in Thailand. So there are a lot of things happening there. I hope, I don't want to take too much time because we have the real experts here, but happy to answer any questions that come up. But I leave it to the real experts to talk about India, which is why I know people are really here. But I hope that that brings about a little bit more interest into ASEAN. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for that, Aaron. Yeah, I really do appreciate kind of setting the table because we all know that these relationships you highlighted are meaningful to India, and they'll have an impact on things. Let me throw it first then over to Joydeep. Joydeep, love to hear your view on what you're looking at for the year ahead and maybe some things you've seen in the past. So over to you.
Thank you, Rick, and thanks for asking me to join the program and your very generous, exaggerated phrase for me at the beginning of the program. I appreciate your thoughts. um, Let me outline how we see India as a rating agency and then maybe talk more about some of the aspects of the future that are important. We have a rating scale which goes from AAA down to D, and in the middle we have a line at triple B minus, and we say if you're above that line, if your rating is above that line, you're in investment grade. And so India's rating happens to be exactly at the floor of investment grade at triple B minus as we have it. If you go below that, you go out of investment grade. Last year, just before the elections, just a few days before the elections, we changed the outlook on our rating from stable to positive. Outlook is just an adjective, it's not the rating itself, but we were signaling that we thought that there would be more chances of an upgrade in this rating than a downgrade looking ahead in the next couple of years. And we did that before the election results came out. And in retrospect, we're very happy we did that before the election results came out because the election results did not change our view. We weren't expecting that Modi would get a setback. We were just following the polls like everybody else was. But I think the point here is that a lot of what we say about India gravitates around Modi because he's a strong character and things become personalized. But as an analyst, you kind of have to look back and say how much of this is structural and moving in a certain direction, and how much of that is being pushed by a strong leader. And that's, we're really focusing on that because the factors that are the strengths or weaknesses of India's rating today, frankly, were quite similar before he came to power. There have been changes, but things haven't changed that much from our point of view. Now, the rating itself, why is it investment grade and why are we positive on the outlook? I think the first thing is just overall macro stability and profile. If you just look at the big picture, India coming out of the pandemic has had a very rapid growth rate. It's come down, as Rick mentioned in his introduction, but most people expect it to be between 6 and 7% this year, which is still very good. And there are bumps along the way. But beneath the growth rate, if you see what's going on, the government a few years ago adopted a strategy of saying that they would reduce their budget deficit, which had climbed enormously, just like any other country during the pandemic, but they would reduce it gradually and at the same time try to promote economic growth. So the debt to GDP ratio, in a sense, would be changed in both ways. First, because the debt would stop growing at the same rapid pace, and secondly, because the denominator GDP would keep growing faster. And it was a sort of a sophisticated strategy, which a lot of people thought may not work because it's just too risky in certain ways for certain people. in hindsight, it turns out it has more or less worked in the sense that they haven't met every single target they wanted, but the debt as a share of GDP has been coming down. It's still very high. And that's one of the factors that keeps India's rating from going up is this high debt burden. But at the same time, the growth rate has been pretty good. So this balancing act of fiscal correction while still growing has worked more or less since the strategy started. And I would call that a success. The second thing I would mention is, the problems that we don't talk too much about, which is, inflation is an issue in India, but it's not a big issue. It's not out of control, and central bank recently cut interest rates. So it's something that could have been worse and was worse in many countries. It's not that bad. The other thing I would mention there is the exchange rate. We're not talking about a crisis. We're not talking about a balance of payments issue. And sometimes it's good to remind people that, hey, there isn't a crisis going on in something when in other countries there is. But I think one of the accomplishments of India going back many years is the monetary flexibility it has gained by having a floating currency. The central bank does intervene, like many other banks do, but more or less it's a floating exchange rate which can act as a shock absorber. And these days, with what's going on around the world and the U.S. dollar strengthening and everything else, it's good to have a shock absorber. So I think those are maybe simple things that people know about, not very exciting, but that's key to long-term growth. Because this kind of, I would add one more thing, the growth of the private sector in India. This is not a reform in the sense of a structural reform or a change in law, but if you just look at the number of companies that are on the stock exchange that are getting listed, or number of companies that are not listed but are growing, and I'm not just talking about startups and unicorns and things like that. I'm talking about across the board. There's just a very big growth in the private sector, which is expected when you have decent GDP growth and demand going back many, many years and political stability. So there's a kind of solidity to the fiscal monetary situation. On the other hand, the debt ratio is still one of the highest in the world as a debt of the government as a share of GDP, and it's coming down, but very slowly. And the interest burden of the government, again, as a share of, say, government revenues, is quite high. I won't bore you with all the numbers, but let's just say those are the factors that hold down the rating. So there's still a lot of progress to be made. I don't want to say everything is wonderful. But going from that, I think longer term, a couple of things to be noted is that this kind of relatively benign macro situation and a continuity in political leadership since 2014 has given India the scope for long-term planning and long-term policy making. And we see that in many areas. Now, politics is always going to be influenced by short-term considerations. There's always going to be a state election somewhere. But we can see that there are structural issues that are being dealt with. And the latest one is the income tax law for individuals. Earlier it was the GST, the value-added tax, which was put in many years ago, and it gets reformed a little bit every year. It's still a work in progress, but it has been successful. Subsequently, there was a change in the corporate tax law, which really encouraged private investment by lowering tax rates considerably and simplifying things. And now the government has just come up with the personal income tax law, which moves in the right direction in terms of making life simpler and making it easier for people to comply. So these are changes which take time, and the benefits show up over time. But they're very encouraging things, I think, to see what's going on in India. Now, challenges are there, as we all know. One challenge I'd highlight, it's not unique, is that India does create lots of jobs for its people. It's just that a lot of those jobs are very lowly paid and they don't require much skill. Or the other way of saying it is the workforce, a lot of the workforce doesn't have very much in terms of skills. This is not a new challenge. This has been around forever, but it's becoming a bigger issue now because as the economy grows, we see demand for skilled workers and any skilled labor rising and wages rising as a result of that. But at the bottom end, you've got a lot of the workforce that really just cannot fill those jobs. So this is a challenge. How it works out will have an impact on the growth rate into the future. But I think it can be managed. It has been acknowledged. The other challenge, I won't go through a list of 20 things that need to be done, but I would just say that from an institutional aspect, if you look at the Indian legal system, the Indian administrative system, they all need sort of an upgrade. And it's not S&P saying they need it. This is the government of India itself in its own reports have said the same thing. They've, the systems every now and then do need to have a revamp. And that's especially true as the country urbanizes, because one of the weaknesses of India compared with ASEAN countries or compared with China is Indian urban government is very, very weak and ineffective. This is a structural issue, so nothing to do with whether you're a democracy or not. It has to do with how you organize local government at the city level. And this is a long-term challenge because it's an institutional challenge, and it's really a challenge for the state governments more so than the national government. So I'd say that's something to look forward, because I'm talking about long-term issues, because India gives us the luxury today of focusing on long-term issues. And finally, in terms of the current context, I'd have to mention that the last budget and the emphasis it put on deregulation was a welcome development. This is not new. This has been talked about for a long time, and India is not the only country which is looking at such things. But to the extent that there is real progress on this, that would be helpful for us, because deregulation would, among other things, help sustain a higher GDP growth rate. If India's growth rate were to fall from the 6% range or something to much, much lower, then there's a risk that its debt burden would increase and its credit rating could go down. If the growth rate continues, or actually if it gets even higher, then there's the opportunity that what I just said goes in the opposite direction and the credit rating goes up because the debt becomes more manageable. So ultimately, growth is the key to the India story. It's holding up well. And maybe if India can manage the relationship with the US, there could even be an upside in terms of growth. Obviously, the downside is there from trade barriers and things like that. But I would say India is better positioned than many countries to manage the situation, but there are risks. So I'll turn it back to you, Rick.
Thanks, Joydeep. I love the point you brought up, mentioning both states and cities, and I might ask you a question later that digs into that a bit more. But I'm often asked about the changes, the differences in governance between the United States and India, and I say our national governments have almost the same powers and authorities. Here in the United States, then your government touches or your state government, your county, your city. And in India, most of that is really compressed at the state level. So in some ways, states are maybe more powerful than India in terms of determining the direction of people's lives than you see even in the United States. So I appreciate those thoughts and bringing up that it's not just the union government issue that we're grappling with here. But Christian, let me hand the floor over to you. Always got great insight, so appreciate you joining today.
Sure. Maybe I'll pick up from where Joydeep left off in the sense that maybe it's just explaining our ratings and maybe looking at some of the challenges ahead and perhaps maybe the differences in terms of how we're seeing things. I guess firstly, just related to the scale, just to remind our audience, we broadly, Moody's and S&P broadly have the same scale, and we have the sort of same investment grade line. And we have positioned India similarly to S&P in terms of having India at the bottom of that investment grade floor. Where we do differ is on the outlook, where we have maintained a stable outlook. And I guess I want to explain that a little bit. But in general, I think the one way to sort of encapsulate Moody's credit view on India is that it balances its formidable strengths, primarily with regards to the economy, just like Joydeep had mentioned, very strong growth rates. But given, I guess, but with some different sort of considerations. In essence, those strengths with regards to the economy and perhaps some of the increasing or improvements in things like monetary and macroeconomic management, given the implementation of inflation targeting over the past decade, which has, I think, served India very well, along with perhaps regulation and how the RBI has helped to resuscitate. And I don't use this word lightly. Really resuscitate the financial system from some of the troubles that they had in 2018, 2019, even before the pandemic. And so those strengths are really balanced against the weaknesses with regards to fiscals. And the way we see growth is that the high growth is really necessary to stabilize the fiscal situation given the very high debt. While we do acknowledge that there has been progress over the past 3-4 years with regards to um, enacting sort of this fiscal consolidation, emerging from the pandemic. And indeed, the union government is likely to meet its fiscal deficit target of achieving a 4.5% GDP deficit by the fiscal year that will be starting in April. So yes, we acknowledge all that, but I think at the end of the day, we would also want to see how India performs versus itself over a much longer time frame, not just the past 3-4 years, but also versus itself. And also, I think key to this, just given how ratings are ordinal rankings, that is, their rank orderings of risk relative to other countries, they are actually doing not that great. But let me explain. The deficit, yes, they'll at union government level, they will reach 4.5% of GDP, or that is our expectation. But this is actually still wider than the deficit that India had prior to COVID. So the sense of fiscal repair, is that it really is quite incomplete. And when we talk about how other countries, especially those in emerging Asia, in ASEAN, the pace of fiscal consolidation has proceeded faster in many of those countries, many of them very closely rated peers, those around the same rating level, or maybe just above, like Indonesia and the Philippines. So here we still see weaknesses on the fiscals, and I think over the longer term, I think one important development that was announced in the budget was the concurrent announcement of a medium-term outlook. Maybe perhaps just to remind the audience that beyond the 4.5% of GDP deficit that was expressed by the finance minister as a goal, a medium-term goal, which they've held onto and adhered to over the past few years, they never actually mentioned anything about a fiscal anchor beyond 25, 26. It was always, we will be flexible, and we will have we will do just enough so that we will effect a downward trend in the debt trajectory. So now we actually have some information, some of those projections with regards to how they see the debt burden over the next 7-8 years through the early 2030s. And here on the central government level, at the union government level, we're actually only seeing very marginal improvements. So from around 57% of GDP today to basically 50% by 2030-31. According to our methodology, that really isn't much of an improvement, doesn't really move the needle. So in essence, the picture that we have is still intact, where those formidable economic strengths are balanced or offset those really persistent weaknesses related to the fiscals. So that's the overall view on the credit. But let me sort of transition and perhaps make a connection to some of the more pressing challenges today. With regards to the fiscals, I think there is some wariness on our part with regards to some of the revenue assumptions. I think the key headline measure with regards to the budget is the higher tax threshold with which people are now liable to pay taxes. So in essence, you are taking a lot of, you are actually narrowing the revenue base. Yes, we understand there were some calculations related to foregone revenue, but the revenue buoyancy that has come out of those projections that are underlying meeting that 4.5% of GDP deficit target by 25-26 does rely on, we think, fairly optimistic revenue projections. That is maybe perhaps offset by some underspending that we expect on the CapEx side. There was a lot of CapEx underspend in the current fiscal year, and that perhaps is due to some of the issues regarding disruptions around the elections that we had in Q2 of last year, or Q1 of the fiscal year last year, or this year rather. And so I think by and large they'll get there, but perhaps there's some optimism both on the revenue and the expenditure side. When we talk about, I guess, the shocks that everybody is wary of with regards to tariffs, I think oftentimes over the past month or so we've been asking ourselves, what actually poses the bigger shock to emerging Asia? Is it the tariff threat from the Trump administration? or given the role that China has had in terms of being an engine of growth for the region for the better part of the past 20 years, is it a structure the structural slowdown in China? So I think there is one argument that says that perhaps countries in the region, because they've sort of lived through the first Trump administration, and there have been some adjustments with regards to supply chain diversification. Aaron talked a lot about that. That perhaps there's a sense that they are better able to withstand that shocks, and companies around the region will know how to sort of navigate their way around these sort of tariff threats. And you can actually see that with regards to FDI patterns. But here again, perhaps I want to talk about some of the weaknesses regarding India. So I think many in the markets would look very favorably upon some of the strong messaging around things like the PLI and the way that India was able to attract investment on iPhones or semiconductors. But actually, when you compare India's competitiveness, their ability to attract FDI versus other ASEAN countries, it's clear that perhaps India is not quite ready in terms of attracting China plus one investments. So you have the likes of Malaysia and Vietnam really knocking India's socks off with regards to those in terms of attracting those kinds of investments. In any case, we do still see that China, the slowing China threat is more of a chronic threat and perhaps more of a structural threat than the tariffs, which could be acute. I think we all know that the way the tariff threat has been used over the past month is somewhat of a negotiating tactic. So perhaps it's more of an acute rather than a chronic issue or chronic threat that is facing the region. The other thing is that countries around the region seem to be diversifying their bets. I'd like to use this sort of Venn diagram that has CPTPP, RCEP, IPEF, and now BRICS, and see who's sort of overlapping. And you'll see that when we talk about these four little groupings, Malaysia and Vietnam stand out because they're the only ones that are part of all four. So in essence, they're kind of like bastions of free trade, if you will. And this is because places like Malaysia have joined BRICS as partner countries. Indonesia is now a full member of BRICS, but Malaysia and Thailand have joined as partner countries. So this is not signaling that they're moving towards China or moving towards Russia. Rather, they see the threat that's coming from the US, and they want to sort of diversify their sources of demand for their exports. So what's missing here is really India. Yes, they're a member of BRICS. They're not a member of CPTPP. They're a member of IPEF, yes, but they also begged out of RCEP. So in essence, a lot of this deregulation, we also see perhaps some issues with regards to trade policy and still perhaps the relatively protectionist stance that the government continues to have, in contrast to perhaps their ASEAN peers. So I guess let me stop there and we can get the conversation rolling.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of hot button issues, Christian. I really appreciate that. For the speakers, as we get in some questions, I've been throwing them in the chat there, so you can get a little bit of a forewarning about what's coming up. But you know, Aaron, just before the session began, as we were sort of talking about you know, kind of the scene setting come into this, I was referring to a brunch that we had with some of the CSIS program leads the other day, and the fact that a lot of folks looking at Europe and climate and things like that were bemoaning some of the initial days of the Trump administration. And I was over in the corner smiling a little bit because, of course, we got out of the gates pretty strongly with the foreign ministers of the Quad meeting the day after the inauguration. And, of course, the big summit when Prime Minister Moody visited Washington, D.C., which had a lot of continuity, some new ideas, certainly some areas of wobbliness, calling out India as a protectionist country, but overall a little more stability. But, you know, as you look across the rest of the Indo-Pacific, and as Trump looks to launch this global trade war, are there other countries in the region that you think might be prioritized in a good way, places that might see maybe a little bit more stability than what it looks like right now, where everybody is under attack and under pressure? Are there a few countries you can point to and reasons that you think sort of maybe driving that thinking by the Trump administration?
Yeah, I think for every administration, even if it's in their second term with a 4-year break, it's always a journey to discovery to realize that, the Indo-Pacific is an important region both for uh, for economic reasons, but also for diplomatic and military reasons. And so the Trump administration may have to rediscover that. But there are a lot of countries that I think might have a better news story, or at least a better initial relationship with the Trump administration. As we've all said, most of these guys, they've learned lessons from the first Trump administration. There's some consistencies. I think the one thing that is probably his most consistent policy is looking at everything through a trade deficit lens. So he's going to rack and stack to see where the countries are. Some countries have the ability to say, well, we've invested, tens of billions of dollars into the United States. Those two countries would be South Korea, although politically they're in a little bit of a bind right now. So we'll have to see where that goes. That's a story for another rating session. But Japan, I think, is also in a good place. The trade relationship isn't necessarily, I think, where Trump would like it. But Japan has already announced a big investment after the Ishiba visit. And I think that they're really pushing on adhering to Trump's more hawkish nature on China, that Japan is a very good partner on that. For the rest of the region, Australia is in a much better place than it was in the first term as well. The trade balance is more into the US's favor. And I think Australia has done quite a lot to try to build its relationship with the Trump administration, to try to highlight some of the things that really bring them together, whether it's, IPEF is probably not going to be the highlight, but things like AUKUS, but also in trying to work together to bring the region on board and try to counterbalance China. In terms of Southeast Asia, it's going to be a bit of a mixed bag. I think right now the Philippines are probably in the best position, and our trade relationship with them is more favorable to the United States. But the Philippines provides a lot in terms of added value or necessity to what the U.S. economy needs. I think when I mentioned the journey to discovery, I think it's going to be along the lines of supply chains. The Trump administration is really focused on bringing reshoring manufacturing jobs back to the United States. But unless we become an autarky, in many ways, this is just not possible, whether it's on critical minerals or being able to have the comparative advantage or the capabilities of doing things that we really want to do, including on semiconductors, electronics, and pharmaceuticals, which are actually the three things he said he was going to put tariffs on in April. So we'll see. But the Philippines and Indonesia play important roles on that. For the Philippines, they're big in terms of call centers. They were also part of the semiconductor supply chain. They did receive funding from the CHIPS Act, what was called the ITSE Fund, to help build up workforce capabilities and to build on the types of industries they already have related to the semiconductor industry. In that case, Thailand as well fits, pretty well into that. For Indonesia, it's on critical minerals. They have nickel, they have others as well. I think the downside to that is China really has most of those mining rights, or in terms, not necessarily even just mining, but processing. So, I think that there are some advantages. And the other thing I think is just comes down to personality and relationships. Marcos has a relationship that dates back to the 1980s. There was a Trump Tower in Manila, and the families were fairly well known to each other. Prabowo from Indonesia has already made a visit to Mar-a-Lago and has been in touch with the Trump administration. So I think that they're really going to push on the personal relationship. And I think that's something that a lot of folks in the region learned from the first one, whether it was through Modi or through Shinzo Abe. You even see the Vietnamese trying to do that as well. But some winners, some question marks. But, I think for now, I would say the Philippines are probably going to be the big winner out of Southeast Asia. I think Japan, Australia, and once South Korea gets its act together, that there will be formidable partners as well.
It's striking, although not terribly surprising, that those that you thought would be viewed positive, it is about the commercial linkages rather than security, since we don't exactly know what kind of approach President Trump is going to take to China. It seems like every day you see a different sort of rhetoric coming out, but appreciate those thoughts, Aaron, as we think about others that may have relative stability and otherwise. Joydeep, something that a thread that you sort of touched on a little bit, and Christian did on manufacturing. It was just 10 years ago, the Modi government announced this Make in India program where they wanted to move manufacturing from about 13 or 14% of GDP up to 25% by 2025. Well, here we are, and manufacturing GDP is still about the same, 13% or 14%. You've seen a change, I mean, from pure play protectionism early on, customs duties and things like that. Now with industrial policies like the production linked incentive, do you see some green shoots that these programs might be working? But writ large, is it really important that India gets manufacturing right? Or is the world changing and India's dominance in services might become really the engine for future prosperity? So can you give us a bit of context on how you look at the manufacturing piece of this?
Sure. It's a complicated subject, and it gets into a lot of historical disputes. I would say if you look at countries that have developed since the Second World War, most of the successful countries have had some kind of industrial strategy, whether it's Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, whatever. I mean, they differ and sometimes they contradict each other, but everyone's done something. No one sort of sat back and said, let's just see what manufacturing naturally appears. And so India tried that, and the record, at least till 1991, was disaster. I think we all know about the protectionism plus licensing Raj, things like that. So it's been difficult for India to come up with industrial manufacturing strategy that is successful, not just economically, but also in terms of meeting political goals to have certain industries done at home. So I think to put a favorable gloss on what's happened recently, the industrial strategy of recent times, including the PLI scheme, the sort of a subsidy for companies that produce larger volumes of output, I think it's more or less helped. It's more or less worked. Now, some schemes have worked well, like electronics, I think as Christian was mentioning, and other schemes have not worked well at all. Schemes for promoting labor-intensive manufacturing have not worked very well at all. But from the point of view of a country acquiring key technology and being self-sufficient, or at least somewhat sufficient, in key areas of manufacturing, which is a policy goal, I think India is making progress. Now, that's the good part. That's the glass half full. What's the half empty part is the numbers you just cited. Manufacturing as a share of GDP is more or less stagnant. As Christian was mentioning, the displacement of investment from China, or whatever you want to call it, has really gone to other countries like Vietnam or Malaysia. India's got some of it, but it's not a significant amount. And overall foreign direct investment numbers, are okay, but not great. So I think it's kind of a mixed answer to your question. Manufacturing will not hit 25% of GDP, but it will develop in a way that is useful for the strategic balance in India vis-a-vis other parts of the world because it needs certain technologies. The service sector will keep growing faster than manufacturing. And I think, in the future, there'll be more service component within a manufactured product. Just like think about how much services are inside your iPhone. The iPhone manufacturing itself, costs next to nothing compared to the design, the app makers and the programmers and others. So in that sense, this is not a fatal flaw. This is something India could live with. But what's the cost of doing so? The cost is that you forego some of the labor-intensive industries that other countries in Southeast Asia have created in the past, and that has an impact on employment and all of that stuff. So you can still grow at 7% or 6% with manufacturing at 14% of GDP. The quality of growth would be better and perhaps a little bit more sustainable if manufacturing did expand. But I'm not particularly hopeful about that.
No, that's fair. Let me throw one over to Christian. Also talking about manufacturing, I think to a large extent, we've actually seen a lot of the sectors that India wants to get big. It isn't just PLI programs, but actually you've seen some of India's large conglomerates we all know well announcing major investments in solar manufacturing, building solar farms, semiconductors, things like that. Is there a concern right now, as you don't see this swoop of foreign investors coming in necessarily and taking advantage of a lot of these sectors, about over concentration with a few biggies? Is that dangerous, or is it good to see somebody stepping in the breach and actually creating some of these manufacturing industries? So is there much of an impact in how you look at the ratings for India about potential concerns about over concentration by the conglomerates, or is it net a good thing, or not really such a big deal?
Well, I think I guess the concern really is about headline risk. I think we all know kind of what happened with Adani. And so, for example, in terms of some of the questions I have fielded, from investors over the past half a year or so has been like, well, is this how things are run in all conglomerates in India? So there is this bit of a headline risk, if you will, but not necessarily systemically. It's not a systemically fatal flaw, if you will, because a lot of the funding that goes into these corporates in these large conglomerates are really domestically based. Yes, the likes of Adani, the likes of Tata have engaged in cross-border lending, but I think by and large, one of the key credit strengths of India, as it pertains to both the government and the private sector, is just that broad reliance on domestic sources of funding. This could be perhaps a bit of an issue when you talk about the sort of slower liberalization of the capital account. There have been benefits, of course, in terms of the way that there has been increased investment into the government bond sector, as the government bonds have been included into a lot of these international indices of international bond indices, like JP Morgan's MB and the Bloomberg and the Barclays index. And so you do have much more diverse sources of funding for the government, and it's had some spillover effects as people invest to the weights of those indices, and so that includes perhaps some private sector exposure. But I think there is this wariness about that headline risk. So I think it would be welcome if the government did kind of get out of the way and perhaps not cozy up to some of the sort of some of the sort of more traditional destinations of investment is perhaps how I can put it. But if there's a much more competitive arena in terms of getting government contracts, because I think that's what we're talking about here with regards to some of the troubles with Adani. I think it could become a much more competitive place for investment. I think we have heard on the ground with a lot of the foreign businesses, like a lot of the American and European businesses, despite some of the headlines being put forth by the Modi administration for the past couple of years, there is this sense that on the ground itself, it's still not a level playing field. So it's not a systemic flaw yet, but I mean, it is perhaps a natural outturn, if you will, of being in that sort of protected environment. So I think that's how I'd put it.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Well, it actually flows pretty well, Aaron, to the next round of questions and what I want to tee up for you, which is other Indo-Pacific nations sort of use on India. I know this is very qualitative, but in your interactions with leaders from countries across the rest of the Indo-Pacific, is India this sleeping giant, an emerging giant? And we know the numbers. It's about to leap over both Japan and Germany to be the world's third largest economy, but you still hear hanging in the rafters sometimes this idea that India is the country of the future and always will be. I know that term's been used about a lot of different countries, but certainly we hear it about India. Does India come up at all when you're engaging Southeast Asia countries, when you're talking to Japan? And how is it kind of characterized, or is it really still sort of flying below the radar screen?
So I think my answer is probably going to generate a lot of angry messages to us, but yes, it's the country of the future and always will be. When India gets brought up, it's also coupled with a lot of frustration. I think for countries like the United States and for Japan, but particularly for the United States, and trying to push this relationship with India, really seeing it as, okay, this is going to be the country that gives other countries an alternative to invest with or to engage with, partially because of the size of the economy to invest in, but the potential for them to invest in the region. And that just never seems to happen. I've had my own experiences in working in Myanmar, which I worked there for several years. There was really an effort to try to help Myanmar engage much more with India so that they wouldn't be so reliant on China. There were lots of discussions with the Myanmar government. And of course, this was during a bit of a different time when there was more of I don't know if you could ever say democratic, but more open government. And they're like, yeah, sure, we would love to work with India. We have these two ports that are up for bid. One is going to the Chinese, but we don't want them to have both. And, it's just, it never materialized on the Indian side. And I think that there's been a lot of frustration and disappointment. There's been a push, I think, especially through the Quad, to try to get the Indians much more involved in the region and looking at opportunities of where there could be. I mean, India, the ability to scale on pharmaceuticals, on manufacturing, on um, climate energy related investments, including solar panels. But it's just kind of missing the boat in trying to put investments overseas. Part of that could be a bit of protectionism and making sure that India continues to grow and that there's employment opportunities for its incredibly large and young population. So there's probably a bit of a competitive edge there as well. But I think when you talk to the region, which also has the same cultural ties in many cases that the region has to China, that you would think that there'd be much more of a natural engagement there. But I think there's just a lot of frustration. You see more investment going into India than out of, and I think we're still kind of waiting to see it go. I mean, I have to say myself, I get caught up. I'm like, yeah, India's going to be great, but I might also be in terms of the country of the future and always will be.
Well, Joydeep, we talked a little bit about Trump administration, who's been actively talking about, this tariff war against the world. And we've seen successive U.S. administrations, even if they don't have quite such an overt way of putting it, of decoupling from China, at least for strategic sectors, on trying to reduce reliance. India's taken a lot of its own steps, certainly on the services side with banning some of the apps like TikTok. And you've seen some of India's industrial policy looking to replace areas where they've got heavy China imports. Do you see any kind of a risk, or is there an opportunity? And I know this is partially looking at the short term and long term, with India's own steps to decouple from China. Are they too over reliant on China in certain areas, and there could be some damage there, or is it really an opportunity because they haven't placed as much of India's own company manufacturing in China? So I wonder if you can talk about India's own decoupling, and if you have any top line views on what that might mean for the near term and longer term.
Sure, this is a tough one because how decoupling as a policy is difficult. I mean, just think of how we decouple the U.S. from China. I mean, given the links. In the Indian case, the relationship is mainly, not largely, I would say, reliance on Chinese products, whether it's the particles that go into pharmaceutical production or solar that you mentioned or other kind of technologies. So it's very difficult for India to either produce those things by itself or to get it from third sources. So there is a dependence, as opposed to having huge stock of Indian foreign direct investment in China, the way the US or European countries do. That's not really the issue over there. And similarly, there is Chinese foreign investment in India, but it's not of the scale that you would find in other countries as well. So, on the investment flows and things like that, it's a little bit more manageable because there's less potential disruption. But India has a huge trade deficit with China, and sometimes China, if you add in data through Hong Kong, is the biggest trade partner. So that you just cannot get rid of because you can make your own substitutes at an outrageously high price. You could try to find somewhere else in the world which produces this, but that's not happening very easily. So I think, and the fact is that China and India are neighbors, and they've had their clashes at the border. But you have to get along with your neighbor in one way or the other. It's a lot easier to have the Pacific Ocean between the US and China. So I think this is going to be a source of friction and contradictory policies. It's an art of managing contradictions. And I think there'll always be sort of, one step this way, another step that way. But the goal, I think, is from the Indian side, is to reduce strategic vulnerability as quickly as possible, but not necessarily, blanket trade protection or against all things Chinese, because the costs of that are just too high, as we've seen. And a lot of Indian companies have complained, for example, that restrictions on Chinese visas to Chinese engineers and others have hurt production in India because you need those people to do certain things. So this is going to be a source of friction domestically as well, I think, between industry and government.
If I could just jump in here.
Yeah, please.
In terms of just this managing contradictions, I think we also need to sort of put into context, I think, some of Modi's sort of global ambitions. And I think India has really emerged over the past decade in terms of, I guess, its burgeoning role as a leader of the global South, I think, which also China wants to sort of claim. And so I think it is this sort of strategic competition, if you will, that perhaps leads India to manage that sort of competition with China. So indeed, while there are perhaps headlines regarding conflicts at the border, you also have areas where they're clearly collaborating. Whether it's on the global decarbonization. I think now it looks like the U.S. is on the other foot, and India and China are actually making great progress with regards to decarbonization. Or in terms of the sort of global institutions that are vying for competition against the sort of old mainline IMF, World Bank, cabal, if you will. Now we have the New Development Bank, which is kind of like the BRICS Bank, or AIIB. It's often identified with President Xi or China, but actually India is the second largest shareholder. So there is this sort of sense that they are competing for the hearts and minds, if you will, of the global South, and that's what keeps them cooperating as well.
Yeah, two massive countries. There is no one size fits all when you try to describe the relationship, is there? Well, Christian, I have the last question that I want to throw over to you. The big news coming out of the U.S.-India summit, perhaps, was the announcement of the initiation of talks for a bilateral trade agreement of some type. And we don't know the contours. They said some sectors, this and that. But India's been signing. We talked about RCEP and some other things happening in the region, but India's been signing a few bilateral deals of its own with Australia, with the United Arab Emirates, the Swiss-led EFTA group. Trade agreements, in this town, when you got a lot of trade wonks, including my building, it seems like the biggest thing when you talk about trade flows. United States, a lot of our largest trading partners, we don't have trade agreements with. So, the impact I know can kind of go either way. But is India's own a web and network of trade deals, including something possible with the United States, is that meaningful? Is it impactful with how you look at sovereign ratings? Or is that kind of a nice to have and sort of works around the edges? So give us a little bit of context on that.
Okay, well, I think I guess the context here is I guess you have to take into context the contours of what I just mentioned about how we view the ratings in general. So it's this formidable economic strengths balanced against the weaknesses on the fiscals. What the trade deals have the potential to do is really enhance those economic strengths if implemented correctly. Now, I think one thing that is kind of reflected in the way the Biden administration really started to pursue IPEF is that it's really not about just opening up markets for goods trade, which was the sort of traditional way you would do an FTA. But it's actually in this sort of day and age, it's really more about the other things, particularly with regards to services and investment. So can any new deals that India hammer out with perhaps the U.S., can they open up markets for further further expanding the services provision? Maybe they've lost the sort of call center crown to the Philippines a long time ago, but the Philippine call centers are actually using Indian technologies. I think it's a lot of the TCSs and a lot of the large Indian conglomerates that are actually putting money in the Philippines. So basically using Indian sort of infrastructure and processes, but Philippine labor. Is it about investment again? Can you open up investment? Can you open up India? Perhaps on a bilateral basis, could that improve flows with regards to some of these higher value added sectors that perhaps the PLI, as we had discussed, there's a bit of a mixed bag. But I think probably more importantly, can you sort of make avenues, inroads towards more investments in lower value added industries, because a lot more of these labor intensive types of manufacturing are the ones that are going to give you the sort of bang for the buck with regards to employment growth. And I think we saw some positive signs there, not in the context of trade deals, but in the budget, where they did announce schemes regarding toys, something that perhaps China had done a long time ago. But you have to wonder, with all the focus on semiconductors and solar panels and EVs, these are not the kinds of investments that are going to generate the hundreds and thousands of employment that you really need to sort of change things up.
Yeah, it wasn't in the context in the same line as announcing the trade deal talks, but in the joint statement, there was a demarcation where the United States, said that we'll focus on capital-intensive manufacturing industries, whereas India would focus on labor-intensive as a way to try to make America great again, and Make in India work together. But we'll see if both leaders can follow through in practice. Let me just thank my speakers here. I mean, a lot of great topics that were brought up. The need for fiscal discipline and reforms in areas like legal remediation. FDI into India is stable, but clearly not a wave, not yet the main China plus one destination. Some good ideas being taken more seriously by the government on areas like taxation and improving regulations, as we saw announced in the budget. Maybe Indo-Pacific nations are taking some good lessons from the last Trump administration and better able to deal with waves and wobbles. But to Aaron, Joydeep, Christian, thanks for joining. Hopefully you all agree to do this again next year, and we can look back and see if any of our predictions and thoughts came true. But there's always a lot to work on, as we talked about in the India-China. There's just so much there in big countries that there's a lot to follow, and having experts like you all to help us parse through it is incredibly important as a way to kickstart our year. So thanks again, my friends.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.